Tuesday, Wednesdays, happy days. Thursday, Friday, happy. Sorry, I'm really abusing you guys with all this dumb singing stuff. Okay, so where we were, and I hope that little musical presentation went. I know that there was, I don't know what happened with some of the higher notes really resonate through the microphone, and you probably couldn't hear me sing. But, amateur, what can I say? Amateur musician, a wannabe, right? I'm never going to quite make that, right? So the main thing I want you guys to know, of course, that we're in the middle, post-war America. There's the fear, of course, of falling down into depression, but that's not what happened at all. Instead, the Americans enter this extraordinary age of affluence that could be seen in even such things, of course, as you spending and buying their rock and roll and having a really good time with that, and all of this put together makes, there's at least the sense you should think that this really should be happy days, right? I mean, oh my God, all the affluence and all the wonderful things, the babies being born and money here and money there, it seems like it should be happy days, but it wasn't though. And I think that's one of the most interesting parts about this moment. It's not a time of happiness. Instead, it's a time of anxiety. High anxieties for America, to say the least. And indeed, in the midst of happy days, you have Americans who are building bomb shelters in their backyards, waiting for Armageddon, waiting for annihilation to take place or something like that of the entire human species. So clearly, there's at least a sense it should be happy days. It's not. It's an era of tremendous anxiety in America. And the primary reason for that anxiety was the phenomenon that we call the Cold War. The Cold War. Some people would say, and I'm part of this, that what began the Cold War was what happened in Hiroshima, of course, in August of 1945. The United States of America dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, leading to the deaths of over 200,000 people, both immediate and of course long-term deaths that would take place, perhaps even more than the number I tell you. Now the question is, why did we drop that bomb? And there are some this is a huge historical issue. There are some who believe that we shouldn't have dropped, or we didn't have to drop that. Of course, that Japan was perhaps going to negotiate surrender. The reason we do, the official reason, of course, was that the invasion of Japan would be so costly. They estimate, 500,000 to even more million casualties or something associated with an American invasion of Japan, as the Japanese would fight, every single little street by street or something like that. But there's the suggestions that maybe this wasn't necessary. There are a whole bunch of people who believe that it wouldn't be necessary. Major world leaders and major military figures who kind of say this. And other things that are pushing this, of course, would be what we call the bureaucratic rationale. So much money spent developing the bomb that there needed to be some outcome associated with it. So that maybe it was just the outcome of this huge Manhattan project, and a kind of logical ending to that. But one of the interpretations of the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima and of course Nagasaki, and the Nagasaki one is troubling too. And why do it twice? Well, maybe the second time is to prove that it's not a fluke, right? Let them know this is real. But many people think that not only was the atom bomb basically the last bomb of World War II, but it's the first bomb of the Cold War. So the bomb was not dropped for the benefit of Japan, but rather for the benefit of Russia, to let the Russians know, of course, that there's a new game that's emerging in the aftermath. The Americans are the top dog in that situation. And so that becomes, the beginning, and the first salvo that would be fired in this interesting and very problematic situation called the Cold War. What the Cold War is a situation of global antagonism. So that means that people are antagonistic to each other in a fairly severe kind of way, preparing themselves for war, of course, but stopping short of it. That's why it's a Cold War. A hot war means you're actually shooting. Cold Wars means you're on the verge of doing something. You're on the verge of a war. In this bipolar presentation, so that means that there are two sides to this. And the one side, of course, was the United States and the so-called free world, and the other side was the Soviet Union, of course, the communist world, at least from the point of view of the Americans, kind of the unfree world. Now, the causes of the Cold War are complicated, and I have to tell you, this is where it kind of gets personal, and I do worry that my interpretation could trouble others, but I really do believe that the United States caused the Cold War. The Russians were hammered by World War II. They were devastated, and by the way, they'd been our allies fighting against the Nazis. But in my estimation, it's kind of this notion of this economic problem begins to generate it. But Part of the Cold War is simply your basic nation-state rivalry situation. So the United States and the Soviets are beginning, in the face of just the destruction of the European situation, the two major players in terms of the world, of course, and in almost every single situation when there are these large nations, in the anarchic nature of our globe, they're going to be rivals with each other. Right now, it's the United States and China. It's just sort of the way that it works itself out. So there's an economic issue, there's sort of the basic nation-state rivalry issue, and there's this incredibly ideological foundation to that the Americans simply could not see the Soviet Union other than this incredible threat to the world. This vision of world revolution, communist world revolution, spreading across the globe like this contagion, of course, this domino effect, one nation after another. Never really trying to see exactly what the Soviet Union was all about. And there are voices from the Soviet Union that really play on to this notion, of course, of world revolution. I'll admit that. But the general behavior of the Soviet Union was much more like a kind of a problematic but relatively normal nation state doing the best it could to protect and aggrandize itself. But anyway, I present a lot more on the Cold War for you guys in the notes that I provided. I realize that I've kind of taken up too much of your time in terms of these videos, so if you're interested in more in my interpretation of the Cold War, I'd ask you to look at those notes. I'm more interested here in kind of the results of the Cold War. So here we go. And clearly, this is personal. So I want to tell you the story of poor little Chris, And I feel like there's a whole bunch of people like me, poor little Chris, that kind of endured what the Cold War was all about. When I was, I think, in first grade, there was something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that crisis, was the Russians were trying to put missiles in Cuba. In fact, they actually did put missiles in Cuba. The United States realized this, of course, and then set out to kind of stop this. And you have Russian ships coming to Cuba and American vessels ready, and American planes in the air, Russian planes in the air. And it was this moment where it's a crisis. It's a crisis situation. It could have gone very, very badly. It could have led to nuclear war. Now, I didn't know all of what was going on because I was a 6-year-old. But I knew that there was some problem. And the things that resonated with me was that we were having to do duck and cover drills. So we're having to jump under our desk, when their alarms would go off. And I have to tell you, it gave me great respect for my desk. Like my desk could protect me from nuclear annihilation. Those desks were really well built in those days, of course. Kind of a ridiculous kind of notion. But the thing that really got me were the air raid sirens. And so, periodically they would have the air raid drill. And the air raid siren, for whatever reason, was right across from my elementary school. It was put in a parking lot right across. I remember it was like on a stand or something like that. And then the actual siren part itself. And it's that wailing sound, whoa, up and down kind of wailing. And I just remember that I would be terrified by that. I thought, oh my God. My kids are like, they were terrified by earthquakes. It's like, I think they could understand a little bit how, but I was terrified of that siren, And I really did kind of have a little bit of a little kid nervous breakdown, and I would run home every day to see if my house had been bombed. And you guys all know this is really a pathological situation. It's not healthy at all. And it began to present itself in my schoolwork. And I remember I was, would go to the principal, and we had a really nice principal, and she then met with my parents, and they were trying to figure it all out. And they realized that I was like paying way too much attention to the news. My dad's watching the news intently, and I'm like standing on his shoulder, and I'm just, all this stuff is coming in, and they pretty much said, you need to cut him off. You can't let him see what's going on. It's weird how that's exactly how I felt today. Like, I don't want to watch the news. I don't want to see anything about the pandemic and that kind of way, because when I watch that, I just kind of go into this really bad place. Anyway, I hope when you watch history class, you don't go in that kind of bad place. That'd be really nice. But I know that I suffered this. I know that my sister suffered this. I know that there must have been other kids, So it wasn't just, and the kids all around the entire world that will have to kind of live in this fear of what they called MAD, mutually assured destruction. It was one of those things. If you fixated on it, the fact that there are nuclear weapons, that they could destroy us all in 30 minutes, it's a very unhealthy place to sit. And I would recommend you not to go into that. Don't go there. Stay away from it as much as you possibly can. But when I think of the Cold War, I think of the damage that I felt, the fear that I felt as a child, even more, it continued as I grew older too, having to live under the threat of nuclear annihilation. Just a really, there's all those other threats to us. I know that too. So yay, how fun is that? There's other threats. But this is the one I want to focus. I thought about a lot, and of course I'm telling you about it right this particular moment. I just have a little anecdote about the siren situation. So, I grew up as a little kid, those sirens, and they scared the crap out of me. So when I was first year we were married, we took this cross-country trip, Patty and I did. And we're in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. And we were in a motel. And we, drove all the day through Utah into Colorado, going to stay there for the night. It's 10 o'clock at night, we're going to bed. When all of a sudden I hear a siren wail. It's the air raid siren. And I just sit bolt up in bed and sweat's beating up. And I'm going, oh my God, is this it? I mean, took me right back to my youth in those moments. And I'm trying to do, what's going on here? And I realized it was 10 o'clock, and I don't know if you guys know, but some small towns, they use sirens for a noon siren to let everyone know it's 12 o'clock. In this case, it was the curfew siren, so all the kids, so they can hear it all around the entire valley. Yeah, time to go home, kids. I don't know, but it took about, it took 30 minutes off my life right there. Just scared the crap out of me. Anyway, it's just continuation of the traumas suffered because of the Cold War for poor little Chris and others. Another result of the Cold War that I want you to be aware of is something called Mccarthyism. So this was the United States' second big brush, much bigger in many ways, with anti-communist hysteria. And remember what I told you about that hysteria issue. So there's not really a significant threat here, and yet the Americans are freaking out, and therefore it is, we have to perceive it in kind of the hysteria. The roots of Mccarthyism run deep in the American moment right then. It's a pendulum swing. There've been all this period of democratic liberalism and the New Deal and all that kind of stuff that have been really dominant in America. And clearly the pendulum's going to swing the other way to a more conservative kind of perspective on what's going on in America. There was the fact, of course, that the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. That was a terrifying kind of component of the whole thing. And there's the propaganda of the Cold War. The United States is wanting to play up the Russians as a significant threat. So the Americans the government is like generating a sense that, oh my God, the commies are terrible and they're going to take over, that kind of thing. The Chinese Revolution was terrifying in 1950 for so many Americans because, not only was 1 in every 4 people in the world Chinese, but 1 in every 4 people or more actually lived under communist regimes, so that's kind of a terrifying component to it. And then always you have in this situation political opportunism. You got just politicians who play upon the fear. Everyone's kind of a little bit on edge about, God, communism, that kind of thing. And, all you need is someone to push a little harder. And there were individuals who did this. Richard Nixon started his career by calling a longtime Democratic congresswoman from Southern California a pinko and soft on communism. That's all you had to do was brand them as soft on communism, and you're gonna be able to just kind of push them aside one way or the other. But the person who did it the worst was the man for whom this is named after, Joseph McCarthy. I'm not going to use him as identification. He's just kind of for reasons that I will express to you perhaps here. But Joseph McCarthy, how would I describe him to you? I would describe him as a liar, an alcoholic, and a son of a bitch. The guy was really, every once in a while you get these figures in American history that are really bad people. And I think Joseph McCarthy is that. He was a liar. He lied that he had been a war hero in the war. He hadn't really done any of that. Had a picture taken in a plane, and just that's about all he ever did in terms of any kind of major activity. When he gets to office, he was a junior senator appointee for Wisconsin, and he had no role. Nobody paid any attention to him. So he delivers a speech one day. I think it was in Wheeling, West Virginia, to a women's group. And he says that there are 205 known communists in the State Department. So he's just putting out a crazy number. And later on that number was 87, and later on that number was single digits, and there was never any proof that there was anybody. But he just decided to just put out big lies, just keep saying one after another. And the press was culpable. They never really did catch, they always let him say it, and they printed that without really checking exactly what's going on. Not a whole lot of fact checking going on there that should have been there. And he just kept it on. He's going to go after everyone. He's going to go after George Marshall. He's going to go after the United States military, the Army, calling the Army soft on communism. How could that even be, right? And that actually led to, he pushed the whole issue too far. There's what they call the Army McCarthy hearings that would be televised, and in the black and white kind of problematic TV of that time, he looks greasy and slimy kind of guy, and clearly he was a bully and just trying to push his way through every kind of thing. And it finally got to the point where people began to turn upon him, and the Senate will call him, they will censure him, they will say that he perpetrated a fraud and a hoax upon the American people. And I don't know what happens. He's going to go off and die of cirrhosis of the liver or something like that at some point. But what he did was he generated a fear in America that took off. And pretty soon, you have little McCarthys all over the place, and they're targeting people that they call commies, or they're targeting people that they call pinkos, soft on communism. And there began to be just this fear. And the tragedy is that often it it targets other people. It targets people that aren't even part of that. It started to go after homosexuals, and it hit Hollywood super hard. Admittedly, there would have been people in Hollywood who were, kind of radical socialists. They played with communism in their youth or something like that, and it came back to just, haunt them massively. People lose their jobs, destroy their careers. Some to the point of suicide, where they just can't continue on anymore. But it's just this tragedy that America turned on itself. And to me, the irony always was that what the McCarthy people did was what I thought communist people would do. They were blaming people for what they hadn't even done, and bringing them before tribunals and humiliating them, of course, and using lies as the divide. I mean, this to me was exactly how the Soviets did this in Russia to their people, and here these McCarthyites are doing it to the American people and causing a lot of damage as a result. We also, of course, have to be aware of the fact that the Cold War led to hot wars. The Americans perceived themselves as the guardians of the gate, trying to protect the free world in whatever way they could. The tragedy was that this is a time of national liberation, where all of these entities that had been controlled as colonies by European powers are becoming their own countries. And as they did so, they often turned against the capitalist, imperialist countries that had been the colonial powers. And they sought alternative perspectives, and of course, one alternative perspective is communism. Now, routinely, the primary focus of these people was independence. That's the critical thing they wanted. But because they would sometimes at least speak the communist line, the Americans decided that we couldn't let that happen. It's the domino. One communist country leads to another, to another, to another. I always thought that was so weird. If we have so much faith in our system, then why are we so worried that communism is going to take over the world? Which, and it really never does, right? Because it doesn't have the ability to do that. But this notion of kind of guarding the gates and stopping any spread of communism led to hot wars in Korea in 1950. 50,000 Americans died in Korea. And then, of course, the extraordinary disaster that was Vietnam. 25 years of American involvement, ending up being, of course, there's a monumental error and defeat for the United States. 57,000 Americans dying in Vietnam for no good purpose. And that monument is so powerful. I did go there in Washington. Just drops down, and it has the names of everyone who died. And it's perfect. It shows the increased involvement in the war, and then sort of the slow, gradual movement out of the war, and all of those that kind of suffered for their involvement. And, you can ask yourself, what went wrong in Vietnam? We didn't understand what the Vietnamese were all about. They were all about independence, and all we could think of was, communism spreading out of Russia, that this is a Moscow's puppet state or something like that. We had to confront a very irregular warfare style, of course, the Viet Cong and others, and that's always going to be a very difficult thing. The United States Army could go where it wanted and do what it wanted, but as soon as it left, the opposition would take over, regain the position. So that became a problem. Vietnam was helped in large part by foreign powers. China and, of course, Russia would supply them, so they always had at least a store of what they needed, resources what they needed to continue the war effort. And what they needed to do, of course, was not win the war, but they just had to keep from losing it. And if they could keep from losing it, of course, then they hoped the Americans would tire, and that's exactly what happened. The demoralization of the soldiers became hugely important in this. American soldiers, would take this objective, and then they would retreat from it, be retaken, and then they'd take, and this kind of seemed like nonsensical activities on the part of the soldiers led to them to increasingly think that this doesn't make any sense here, And one of the images I have of Vietnam is a soldier, that canvas covering where he's got, the peace sign that he put on. And soldiers are supposed to be warriors. They're not supposed to be peace advocates. And when you have a soldier with a peace sign, then you know that there's confusion and there's demoralization. Thousands of American troops, of course, will turn to drug addiction. Some will suicide. Some will simply desert, of course. As the nation became increasingly uncertain about exactly what they were doing. And in the end, that's the issue. The nation became divided in Vietnam. As a child of that period, I remember that we could have like a dinner table discussion. If it turned to Vietnam, sort of implacable sides that would begin to manifest. You had the hard hat guys, America love it or leave, and they're going to hit the streets. And then you got the student protesters, of course, and they're trying to get out of this war and things. And then they would clash with each other, and it's like no agreement here whatsoever. Just an incredibly divided country. When finally, the Tet Offensive just kind of proved to everyone in 1968 the Americans were not in control of Vietnam. It led to this extraordinarily painful withdrawal of Vietnamization, handing it over to Vietnam, and then this abandonment of Vietnam in the very end, those final days I remember watching that on TV. That would have been 1975, the year that I graduated from high school. and it was just so painful to see. And I kept thinking about the people that were being left behind, and those that had collaborated with the United States, and their desperation. It was just such a horrible thing. And the helicopters would come to the aircraft carriers, and when that was the last time they could trip, they'd push the helicopters off the side so that another one might be able to land and bring more refugees away from it. Just the horrors of Vietnam is something. And by the way, there's a really powerful documentary on Vietnam. If you want to cry a lot, that's something that I might turn to. So anyway, the Cold War comes, and it's going to just hit America, and just it keeps so much of that kind of what could have been just the joy and happiness of this consumer society from really manifesting, because we were all so worried about communism, and also worried about nuclear annihilation, and also worried about things like Vietnam and all these things that come into play at that time. Now, for another group of Americans, it also wasn't exactly happy days. And these were, and it's a little bit of a circle I'm trying to pull us back to. Our first major issue, of course, was Reconstruction and what was going to happen to the freedmen. And, the sad thing is that the question of the relative status of African Americans lingers even to this day in many ways. But there were Black Americans who were not really feeling the happy days, of course, of the consumer society and the affluent generation. But they're going to begin to change their attitudes and behaviors towards the United States at this time. And we're going to see an increase in activism. I don't know if you guys noted, but I use my alliteration right here. So we have affluence, we have anxiety, and ultimately we have activism. The activism is African Americans are beginning to kind of push for the rights that they had been promised so long ago back in the era of Reconstruction. Now, what changed after World War II? I think that's kind of an interesting thing, because it's been the Black Native, right? Horrible time, and then it come the 30s. In the 30s, a little bit better, but not really, because it's time of just economic disaster, even if you have maybe a little bit of racial liberalism emanating from the government and from the White House, But here comes World War II. Here's this involvement of Black soldiers, of course. Here's this increased participation of African Americans. Here's the movement out of the South to places where they can vote, of course, where their lives can be better. All these things that are going to have an impact. And it seems that after the post-war period, the racism had finally been sort of challenged massively by the behaviors of the Nazis, finally discrediting this racism, finally discrediting this social Darwinist notions. People were moving back from that, really stepping back in a major kind of way from that. I think more white Americans began to really think about, what's going on here in terms of African Americans. More African Americans were simply unwilling to accept what was going on. It did become kind of an embarrassment in the Cold War that the United States, we're the free nation of the free, and yet here, of course, we're discriminating against African Americans. And some of the presidents, begin to say that doesn't quite look very good. When, on the one hand, we're talking about what a great society we are. On the other hand, of course, we got all this racism manifest. So things began to change. So I think there were African Americans who were unhappy with the situation, weren't ready to kind of mobilize themselves. There were at least enough white Americans who were willing to begin to question the racial status quo of America, and we do see things begin to change. And one thing that begins, so we're going to call this the Civil Rights Movement, but I have to let you know that there had always been advocates of civil rights. They've been fighting for it forever. The first African who fought against the slave trade, the first slave who fought against who tried to fight against and capture their ship, the slave on the Middle Passage, and the first slave who rose up against his master, of course, and the continuum of individuals, including Frederick Douglass, of course, or Ida B. Wells, or W.B. Du Bois, or Booker T. Washington, or Marcus Garvey, just a whole litany of these individuals. I've been watching the Madam C.J. Walker. Another kind. The miniseries is a little funky, but you still get a sense of this African American woman, who became the first African American female millionaire through her various activities. But we do seem to have this movement beginning to I guess the difference is that they'd always been fighting for civil rights, but now, of course, there's going to be some kind of outcome of that. That's the critical part. So I want to draw your attention to this moment, of course, this event that it begins in many ways. We're going to call the Civil Rights Movement. It will begin to blossom in the 1950s and in the post-war period. And I want to tell you about Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which was a major Supreme Court decision, landmark civil rights case that came forward, was decided in 1954. If you guys remember, I told you about the NAACP and W.E.B. Du Bois, of course. putting together this organization, which was essentially a fundraising organization for the purposes of bringing litigation to challenge the structures of the black nadir, primarily disenfranchisement and segregation. And they had been doing this for a long time, and in the 1930s and 40s, and really in the 40s, there began to be small victories that were taking place. So they won a case for integration at the University of Oklahoma. What had happened, they were beginning to really push the idea of separate but equal. So, the University of Oklahoma had a I don't know what they had, I'm going to say mass spectrometer or something like that they could use. I don't think that's what it was, something about nuclear physics. And they had, one African American student who wanted to study physics, nuclear physics.